Chapter 1 focuses on late Romanticism, specifically the American poets Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. A little bit of background about literary Romanticism is that it starts in the 1800s and it goes through about the 1860s in America. It is not what we typically think of as romantic, hearts and roses and candy, but instead a type of literature that focuses on the individuality of human beings, humans' intuition and emotion over reason, the love and respect of nature, and also the supernatural. Out of the Romantic movement comes the Transcendentalist movement. This movement is a Romantic movement in the 1830s that is specifically localized in Concord, Massachusetts. It focuses on philosophical, religious, and political beliefs of transcendence. Specifically, the authors Emerson and Thoreau emphasize self-reliance, the divinity of nature, the rejection of conformity, and also both were advocates of the abolition of slavery. But when we talk about late Romanticism in particular, we are moving toward the Civil War from 1855 to 1870, right after the Civil War. These two poets, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, are affected, as all Americans were, by the Civil War, and we do see that in their writing. The writing from this period specifically emphasizes a shift in poetic form. For example, Walt Whitman is using free verse. Also, both poets focus on individual expression, the importance of individuality, and both of the poets focus on emotional intensity in their writing. This is a short biography of Walt Whitman. Some of the things included in this biography are also in the reading, but this is just a nice 3-minute concise biography of the poet.
Walt Whitman was the man who revolutionized American poetry. He invented a whole new poetic form, and he opened up topics to a wide range that nobody else would touch.
Walt Whitman was born on May 31st, 1819, in the West Hills, New York. His parents were of modest means, and he had 7 siblings.
At the age of 11, Walt Whitman was pulled from school so that he could help the family support itself in the printing industry. As a result, Whitman was largely self-taught.
He became a voracious reader. He read widely, especially in novels.
When he was 17, Whitman turned to teaching, and his first job was in a one-room schoolhouse. He taught for 5 years, and then in 1841, he set his sights on journalism.
Walt Whitman was a volatile editor and writer. He had strong ideas about women's property rights, about immigration, and about the major issue of the day, slavery.
From 1848 to 1855, Whitman began what was to become his greatest work, Leaves of Grass. His free verse, his stitching together of encyclopedic lists, completely broke with poetic and literary convention, and vastly influenced poets ever after, across the world.
It began as a book of very few poems and grew to one over the years to contain almost 300 poems. Over his lifetime, he had 7 editions of the book.
During the Civil War, Whitman moved to Washington, D.C. to attend his wounded brother George. He stayed in D.C. several years, working in the paymaster's office and volunteered, visiting wounded soldiers.
When he went to the hospitals, there were limbs piled up outside. He spoke with young soldiers who had witnessed the most astonishing atrocities.
From his experience with the wounded during the war, he produced a small book of poems called Drum Taps. This is one of the only 2 accounts of the Civil War written by people who actually experienced it.
Whitman published 2 new collections of poems in 1870, Democratic Vistas and Passage to India.
Whitman was called the Bard of Democracy because all of his poems are based on the notion of a universal brotherhood. He thought that the possibility of America was to achieve a brotherhood that no other culture had yet been able to achieve.
Whitman suffered a stroke in 1873, leaving him partially paralyzed. He moved to Camden, New Jersey, where he remained until his death on March 26, 1892.
In his lifetime, Leaves of Grass was considered by many people to be a disgraceful book. But by the end of his life, he acquired the name The Good Grey Poet, as if America was finally ready in the later years to accept him as a poet.
Whitman never really received the attention that he deserved during his lifetime. It was only in the 20th century that we learned how to read his poetry and understand what he accomplished.
So you're going to read 3 poems by Walt Whitman: Song of Myself, which is one of his most famous poems in Leaves of Grass; O Captain, My Captain, which is about Abraham Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln's assassination; and then Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Whitman is often associated with New York and Brooklyn. You may find all of these readings linked in Blackboard. When you're reading Whitman's poetry, I want you to focus on certain prosody elements of his poetry. Prosody are the patterns of rhythm and sound used in poetry. So one of the most important prosody elements of Whitman's poetry is his use of free verse. In fact, he is one of the first people to use free verse with abandon. Free verse has no rhyme and no meter. Free verse allows the poet to mimic more natural speech, but in order to hold the poem together, the poet does have to use certain sound devices. For example, parallelism is something you will see in Whitman's poetry, repetition, cataloging or listing, sound devices such as alliteration and onomatopoeia, and he also uses varied line lengths to create that visual of a free verse poem. For example, if you look at a Whitman poem, you can see almost immediately that it does not have rhyme or meter. Some of the themes in Whitman's poetry relate specifically to his use of free verse. Not only is he using free verse in the way that he is writing his poetry, but he is talking about freedom and individualism in his poems. He is known as the Bard of Democracy, as we saw in the video. So look for these themes as you are reading his 3 poems, and think about how he is using some of those romantic elements as well as those literary elements to convey these themes. Emily Dickinson is writing around the same time as Walt Whitman. She's considered a late romantic, and her poems are different from Whitman's poems in that they are not as optimistic and positive. And also, Emily Dickinson likes to focus on paradox. We're going to watch this short, maybe 12-minute video that talks about Emily Dickinson's life, but also her poetic style.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course Literature, and today we're going to talk about this lady, Emily Dickinson. By the way, we don't have a book today because she's on my Nook. Emily Dickinson was a great 19th century American poet. Mr. Green, I already know everything about her. She was a recluse, and you can sing all of her poems to the tune of I'd Like to Buy the World a Coke, like, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Stop me from the past. You cannot sing. Fortunately, your inability to sing does insulate us from copyright claims, because I, for one, did not recognize that as If I Could Buy the World a Coke. Also, Dickinson's meter is more complicated than you're making it out to be, but yes, you could sing most of her poems to If I Could Buy the World a Coke. Also, Yellow Rose of Texas. More importantly, these poems have a lot to say about the relationship between death and life, between faith and doubt, between the power of God and the power of individuals. So let's focus on that, because it actually might change your life and stuff. So Joyce Carol Oates once called Emily Dickinson the most paradoxical of poets, the very poet of paradox. And this can really frustrate students and literary critics alike, particularly when Dickinson seems to contradict herself within a single poem. Take, for example, this bit of light verse. Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. So this seems like a pretty pro-science, anti-religion poem, right? I mean, faith is put in quotation marks and called an invention. But she also implies the possibility of a different and valuable kind of sight only available to some people at some times, when gentlemen can see. And this is where it becomes important to look at how Dickinson, for lack of a better phrase, sees sight. Dickinson often imagines seeing as a form of power, so much so that seeing, not just literal sight, but also the ability to witness and observe observe and understand becomes the central expression of the self. Like her famous poem that begins, "I heard a fly buzz when I died," ends with the line, "I could not see to see," associating the lack of sight with death itself. Dickinson also often played with the fact that this eye and this eye sound the same. Her poem beginning, "Before I got my eye put out," is about death, for instance, not just monocularization. In that poem, she clearly associates sight not just with the power to observe, but with ownership. She writes, "But were it told to me today that I might have the sky for mine, I tell you that my heart would split for size of me. The meadows, mine. The mountains, mine." Of course, in 19th century America, the idea that an eye, possibly a female eye, could own the mountains, the meadows, and the sky was a little bit radical. I mean, all that stuff was supposed to be under the control of God, not any human being who could see it. All of this is made even more complex and interesting by the fact that Dickinson's poems sounded like hymns, and throughout her life, you could see her faith waxing and waning in her poetry. In short, I don't think you can make easy conclusions about microscopes and faith in Dickinson's poetry, but that's precisely what's so important about it. Dickinson's work reflects a conflicted American worldview. I mean, we're a nation of exceptional individuals who believe that we control our success and our happiness, but we are also more likely to profess a belief in an omnipotent God than people in any other industrialized nation. All right, I know you guys want all the creepy, macabre details of Dickinson's biography, so let's go to the thought bubble. So Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 to a prominent family. Her father became a U.S. congressman and lived her whole life in Massachusetts. She was haunted by what she called the menace of death throughout her life, although then again, who isn't? Between 1858 and 1865, Dickinson wrote nearly 800 poems, but she also became increasingly confined to her home in those years, and eventually rarely left her room. She usually talked to visitors from the other side of a closed door, and didn't even leave her room when her father's funeral took place downstairs. Dickinson published fewer than a dozen poems in her lifetime. In fact, no one knew that she'd been nearly so prolific until her sister discovered more than 1,800 poems after Emily's death in 1886. Dickinson was considered an eccentric in Amherst and known locally for only wearing white when she was spotted outside the home. In fact, her only surviving article of clothing is a white cotton dress. This image of a pale wraith clad all in white has become a symbol of the reclusive, brilliant poet. But it's worth noting that for Dickinson, white was not the color of innocence or purity or ghosts. It was the color of passion and intensity. "Dare you see a soul at the white heat? Then crouched within the door," she once wrote. She called red, the color most associated with passion, fire's common tint. For Dickinson, the real, true, rich life of a soul, even if it was physically sheltered, burned white hot. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to the color white. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's a Dalek. Stand more flagrant pandering to the Whovians. Dear White, you're complicated and symbolic. Ah, Dalek! They're not very bright. So White, you're often associated with purity, like wedding dresses. You can symbolize heaven or the creepy infinite nowhere where certain parts of Harry Potter and all of Crash Course Humanities take place. But many 19th century writers inverted those associations, like Melville's famous Great White Wall of Whale, the terrifying blankness of nature. And to Dickinson, White, you were the color of passion and intensity. This reminds us that our symbolic relationships aren't fixed. We're creating them as we go communally. I mean, other than Daleks, which are universally terrifying no matter what color they come in. Best wishes, John Green. Okay, let's take a close look at a poem we've already mentioned, sometimes called Poem 465, and sometimes known by its first line, "I heard a fly buzz when I died." Speaking of which, here in the studio, we've had a genuine plague of flies in the last few weeks. I mean, in the lights up there are thousands of fly carcasses. Okay, let's put aside the fly carcasses and read a poem together about flies. "I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for the last onset, when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portions of me be assignable, and then it was, there interposed a fly, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see." Okay, first let's talk about the dashes. Some critics think that Dickinson's use of dashes as punctuation is just eccentric handwriting or else an accident. I mean, they point out that Dickinson also used similar dashes, for instance, in her cake recipes. Others argue that the use of dashes are a typographical attempt to symbolize the way the mind works, or that the dash is used as a punctuation stronger than a comma but weaker than a period. Regardless, though, the appearance of a dash at the end of this poem, at the moment of death, is a very interesting choice. So in this poem, the speaker is dying, or I guess has died, in a still room surrounded by loved ones. A will is signed, and then the fly, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz, comes between the light and the speaker. This makes it so the narrator cannot see to see, and by now you know what happens in Dickinson poems when people can't see, they're dead. So Dickinson was just a smidge obsessed with death, which means that she got to imagine death in a lot of different ways, as a suitor, as a gentle guide, but here, death is a buzzing fly. So everyone in the room is awaiting the arrival of the king, which before Elvis took over the title in 1958 was a reference to God. But instead of the quiet, peaceful arrival of God they're expecting, it's a dirty little fly with uncertain, stumbling buzz that gets between the narrator and the light. So this poem features Dickinson at her most formal. The lines are very iambic. I heard a fly buzz when I died, the stillness in the room. And they alternate between tetrameter, 4 feet, and triameter, 3 feet. The rhyme scheme throughout the poem is A, B, C, B, which means the first line ends with one sound, the second line with yet another, the third line with another still, and then the fourth line rhymes with the second line. But Dickinson employs her famous slant rhymes here. Like in the first stanza, room is matched with storm. In the second, bee with fly. These words sort of almost rhyme, like room and storm both end in sounds, bee and fly both end in hard vowel sounds, but they don't rhyme. And this discomforting lack of closure is a hallmark of Dickinson's poetry, also of most of my romantic relationships. Only in the final stanza, when death comes, do we get a full rhyme. Me, the I, is rhymed with C, the thing the I can no longer do. So is this a peaceful death? Hardly. I mean, the stillness in the room is broken by the buzzing fly. And yet, with that final full rhyme, Dickinson offers us a bit of peace and closure that we didn't get in the first two stanzas. To return to an old theme, even though we live in an image-drenched culture, this is a good reminder that language is made out of words. And it might sound like overreading to you to say that a full rhyme brings peace, but I'm reminded of the story of Mozart's children playing a series of unfinished scales in order to taunt their father, who would eventually have to go to the piano and finish them. Poetry isn't just a series of images, it's rhythmic and it's metric, and we crave the closure of a good rhyme at the end of a poem. That's why sonnets end with couplets. Dickinson gives us that closure. And then she gives us a Jose Saramagoing dash, the poet of paradox, still haunting us. Thanks for watching our Crash Course Literature mini-series. Next week, we begin a year of learning about U.S. history together. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash.
Right, so for your reading assignments for Emily Dickinson's poems, I Taste a Liquor Never Brewed, The Soul Selects Her Own Society, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. I would encourage you to think about some of the same things that John Green was pointing out in the poem that he reviewed and these poems. Some of those elements that he discussed is that Dickinson's poetry is not free verse, so we do see her using a fixed rhyme and meter. But she does do some interesting things with rhyme and meter. For example, with rhyme, she's going to be using slant rhyme frequently, so see if you can spot that as you read. Also, her meter is well known to be musical. It is often iambic, as he said, but you'll often feel like you could set her poems to music, especially hymns, because you'll see 8-syllable line followed by a 6-syllable line, 8 syllables, 6 syllables. So see if you can see a pattern in the meter. Also, she's going to have unique line divisions in her poems and stop and start lines in places that might not make sense grammatically. She does use those dashes, so see what you can make of that in terms of meaning, and that she will capitalize improper nouns as well as add random quotation marks. So thinking about some of Dickinson's quirks and the way that she writes makes her a really interesting poet. The themes of Dickinson's poetry are death, immortality and the afterlife, nature, isolation, as well as the self and divinity. She often explores contrast and complexities of these very human emotions, especially death. Think about how she personifies death or makes death into a person as you move through the poems that you are assigned. So let's talk about those assignments. Monday and Tuesday of the first week, you should read the assigned poems and take notes. You may choose to print the poems, you may choose to annotate the poems using Kami or some other digital way of annotating. You may also find audio versions of these poems if you would like to listen to the poems as well as read them. Sometime between Monday through Wednesday, make sure that you do the discussion post where you're posting on a theme of a poem from the assigned readings as well as extending a peer's post in a reply in order to get full credit. You do need to complete both of those things by Wednesday night at 11:59. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, you may work on the short literary response, and that has asked you to compare and contrast the voice of the speaker in one Whitman poem and one Dickinson poem. I'm going to give you a couple of reminders or pointers about that assignment on the next slide. And then when you're ready, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, you must take the Unit 1 test. You do need about 60 minutes to take this test. You do have to take it in one sitting, but you may use your notes and your annotations as you take the test. When you're writing the short literary response, there are just a couple of reminders. First of all, this is very short. It is essentially a paragraph just to really practice and hone those skills of analysis. When you're talking about the speaker in a poem, the speaker is the voice that is narrating the poem. It's similar to the narrator in fiction, but it is not the poet. So although Whitman and Dickinson feel autobiographical at times, it would be incorrect to describe the speaker of the poem as Whitman or Dickinson. So for example, you are looking at the voice that is the narrator or who is speaking in the poem. When you discuss comparing and contrasting the voice of the speaker, a good way to do this is to focus on word choice or diction and tone, which is the speaker's attitude towards the subject. So we can often determine the tone of the speaker, the way they feel about the subject, based on the words that they choose, the types of words that they are using. For example, you could discuss how the speaker in a Whitman poem uses natural imagery, and how the speaker in a Dickinson poem uses natural imagery, comparing and contrasting the connotations, meaning the multiple meanings, of the words they use to discuss nature. So in other words, how does the voice of the speaker speak differently about nature in the poems? Don't forget that this is an English class, so you are expected to use MLA. Poems are in quotation, so Song of Myself. And we cite poetry by the line number, so Whitman 22, Dickinson 14. As you're setting up your document for MLA, if it's been a while since you've done that, remember that the left-hand side is your name, Professor Jones, English 2130, and then the date that you are working on the assignment or the date that it is due. You'll also need to do your last name and the page number in the upper right-hand corner. Make sure that you title your document, as you can see here, Analogy of Art, and that is centered. And then the entire document is double-spaced, Times New Roman 12-point font. Please do not forget to cite and to indent your paragraphs. If you have any questions, you can email me at rdjones@gntc.edu. Thank you.